My best friend swore he heard someone breathing under the guest bed while he searched for me, and I was hiding on the completely opposite side of the house at the time. If stories like this keep you up at night, hit subscribe, because this was the last time I ever played hide and seek. I was 15 when this happened, a Friday night in late September, just starting to get cold out. My parents were out to dinner with friends and told me they wouldn't be back until late, so I had the house to myself. I invited my neighbor and best friend Chris over. He lived right across the street, same age as me. We usually just hung out in the basement, played games, watched something. That night we got bored and Chris suggested hide and seek. Sounded a little childish at first, but we'd done it before in bigger groups and it had always been fun. The house was small but had plenty of hiding spots, especially with the lights off. We turned most of them off to make it more interesting, leaving just the kitchen light on. Simple rules. No going outside, no attic, no crawl space. Everything else was fair game. Chris hid first. I covered my eyes in the living room, counted to 50, heard him running off, then silence. I checked the kitchen, the basement door, down the hall, the bathroom, the front closet. Nothing. Upstairs, the floor creaked under every step. My parents' room turned up empty. My own room turned up empty. That left the guest room at the end of the hall. Door cracked open. I pushed it slowly, expecting him to jump out. Instead, dark and quiet. Nothing under the bed, nothing in the closet. I finally found him curled up behind some boxes in the basement storage space. He laughed, asked how long I'd taken. Too long, I admitted. Then we switched. He counted, I hid, slid under the guest bed, pulled the skirt down to cover myself completely. My heart was pounding in the dark as I listened to him come upstairs a few minutes later, slow, heavy footsteps checking the bathroom, then my parents' room. Eventually the footsteps came down the hall, into the guest room, stopping right near the bed. I held my breath completely. His shoes shuffled against the carpet. Then silence, a long one. I thought he'd figured it out, braced myself to be caught, but he just walked back out. I waited a few more minutes for him to call out that he'd won. Nothing. I finally crawled out myself, expecting to find him on the couch. He wasn't there. I called out that the game was over, and a voice answered from the basement saying he was still down there looking for me. That made my stomach twist immediately. I opened the basement door, shouted down. He shouted back, confused, asking where I was hiding. I told him I was already out, standing in the kitchen. A second later he came upstairs, looking genuinely confused himself, asking how I'd gotten up there so fast. I told him I'd been under the guest bed the whole time. He frowned and said he could have sworn he checked that exact room, that he'd heard someone breathing inside it. I told him I'd stayed completely still the whole time. We argued about it briefly, shrugged it off, played another round anyway. But I felt uneasy the entire time after that. Every creak in the house made me flinch. At one point during my own count, I heard a soft thud upstairs, but when I checked, nothing was there. I found Chris in the laundry room that round. Eventually we got tired of the game and sat down on the couch, turned the TV back on. That's when we both froze. A loud bump came from upstairs, like something heavy falling. Chris asked if it was my parents. I reminded him they were still out. We sat there, waiting, until the house went quiet again. Chris suggested something had just slid off a shelf. I wanted to believe that. Then we both heard it, unmistakably clear. The slow creak of floorboards, footsteps moving down the hallway upstairs. We stared at each other, completely still. I whispered that we should go check. Chris immediately said no, but I figured if someone had actually broken in, we couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I grabbed the fireplace poker from beside the couch and told him to stay close behind me. We crept upstairs, the steps groaning under every footfall, my own breathing the loudest thing I could hear. At the top, I pointed toward the guest room. The door was closed now, and I knew for a fact I'd left it cracked open earlier. We stood frozen. From behind the door came a slow dragging sound, like fabric sliding across carpet. Chris whispered that we should leave. Part of me agreed. The other part pushed the door open anyway. The room was dark, the bed and dresser barely visible, but empty. The closet door stood half open. I stepped closer while Chris held back in the doorway, then yanked the closet open myself. Nothing but coats and boxes. We both let out shaky, relieved laughs, trying to convince ourselves it had all been in our heads. Then, just as we turned to leave, we heard it again. Not upstairs this time, but downstairs. The front door, opening and closing. We froze completely. Chris whispered that someone was actually in the house. My stomach dropped. We ran to my room, killed the lights, and crouched there in the dark, poker gripped tight in my hands. We listened. Nothing at first, then faint footsteps on the first floor. My phone was still downstairs on the couch, useless to me. The only way out was down the hall, past the stairs. The footsteps moved closer, then the basement door opened, and the steps went down one at a time. We exhaled together, realizing whoever it was had just gone into the basement, and we took that exact moment to run. Down the stairs, through the kitchen, out the back door, and straight across the street to Chris's house, not stopping until we got there. His parents were home. When we told them everything, they called the police immediately. Officers searched my entire house, top to bottom, and found absolutely nothing. No forced entry, no one hiding anywhere, nothing out of place. They told us it was probably just the house settling, or our imaginations running away with us during the game. But Chris and I both knew exactly what we'd heard. Someone had been inside that house with us. For weeks afterwards, I barely slept. Every creak convinced me someone was in the hallway. That was the last time I ever played hide and seek, figured we'd outgrown it anyway. Chris and I never really talked about that night again in detail, but every so often when we catch each other's eye, I know we're both thinking about it. Even now, years later, I still think about that dragging sound behind the closet door and those footsteps on the first floor. We never found out who or what it actually was. Maybe someone who broke in and slipped out the moment we ran. Maybe something else entirely. All I know for certain is that one night of hide and seek taught us both exactly how frightening it is to realize you're not as alone in your own house as you think you are. What that night really taught me is to trust the instinct that tells you something's wrong, even when everyone around you, even the people meant to reassure you, can't find any proof to back it up. Sometimes the absence of evidence isn't the same as the absence of danger, and listening to that feeling is worth more than needing it explained.